Thank you, Renee.
This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, let me see if I can pull this up. And share my screen. Okay, does everybody see my screen? Let me put it in presenter mode. Okay, how are we? Are we good?
Looking good, thank you.
Okay, great. Let me set my little timer, Jamie, so I don't go over. Okay, thank you for this opportunity. I'm really excited to talk to you today about girls and females on the autism spectrum. This is a passion of mine. This presentation would take days, but I've got about 13 minutes. So we're gonna go quickly. I'll give you the overarching ideas, and then at the end, I'll give you some resources that you can further your knowledge by looking at those resources. So there's really evidence out there that identifies that the criteria used to identify girls on the autism spectrum or autism in general is very gender biased, leaving girls and women often underdiagnosed or misdiagnosed. Basically, what we know about ASD is what we know about ASD as it manifests in boys or in the male population. However, we have learned that female symptoms are often misinterpreted, or compared to only the ways that symptoms are demonstrated in boys. And it's unfortunate that girls on the autism spectrum have often been called the lost girls, because even when females' presentations are clear, they're often overlooked and directed towards another reason. And the diagnosis is often delayed, and it's often been considered a boys' club. So you'll see on this slide that 1 in 34 and 1 in 144 for girls. We know that there's a lot more girls and females out there that are diagnosed or not diagnosed as of yet with autism. Let's see. Females who have intellectual delays or who have limited verbal skills are more likely to be identified with ASD than girls who have average to above average intelligence. It's often the externalizing behaviors of individuals with ASD that prompts people to seek a diagnosis. We hone in on those behaviors that we can see. Things like you're often hear, oh, they line up objects, or they have to have things just right, or hand flapping, or finger flicking, or quote, meltdowns of distress behaviors. Those are things that we can see, and then we hone in on those externalizing behaviors. However, we know that girls often, their behaviors are much more internalized, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. We also know that girls with average to above average intelligence are often identified with other diagnoses prior to getting the correct ASD diagnosis. So you might see a young person, a female, who has the diagnosis of ADHD, obsessive compulsive disorder, anorexia, depression, and the list goes on and on. I'm not saying that they may not have these diagnoses, because they could be co-occurring, but sometimes how autism manifests in the female community often includes some of the characteristics that you might see in these other diagnoses. So we need to keep that in mind. And to keep that in mind, we kind of use this thinking tool of the Occams Razor. And my colleague, Dr. Ruth Aspey, who's a friend and a colleague of mine, who's the co-author of the Ziggurat model. She's an internationally known assessor in the field of autism spectrum disorders. And she and I do a lot together in relation to girls on the autism spectrum. She shared this slide with me not too long ago. And what do we mean by Occam's Razor? We mean, well, if you have a female that you're working with that has a diagnosis of ASD or ADHD, excuse me, or OCD, or depression, or anxiety, or sensory processing disorder, or the list goes on and on, you might want to step back and think, wow, the overarching diagnosis could be autism. And so we need to think from that lens. Let's see, some common reasons for underdiagnosis. Behaviors are not as apparent to the eye of individuals not familiar with ASD in girls. Girls may blend in more. Their communication and social interactions are different and not as apparent as boys. So society often provides girls with more social prompts to respond in socially appropriate ways or to engage in social interactions. So we often see restricted patterns, behavior, and interests, which present very differently in boys than in girls. Girls may not have those outward repetitive behaviors of hand flapping or finger flicking or some of those things, distress behaviors, as often in public. What we have found when we've interviewed with females is that they internalize those behaviors. They've learned to really hold those behaviors in. And then when they're out of the public eye is when they will release and demonstrate some of those behaviors. Society has really encouraged from the time little girls are itty bitty little girls, how to be social and how to imitate socially appropriate behaviors in a very young age. Girls on the spectrum have learned to mask or camouflage. And so we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Some other common reasons for underdiagnosis is girls tend to have interests that are similar to their same age peers. So they might be interested in dolls or animals or literature or crafts or boy bands or texting. And it's not about the particular interests. They oftentimes have more social or nurturing interests, which girls tend to have. It's really about the intensity of the interest. So I have a colleague who shared not too long ago, she was working with a little girl, well, a young lady in middle school, and her interest was in texting. Texting is very common for girls in the middle school ages. However, she was texting hundreds of texts a day, and she was also texting to people she didn't even know. That's when the red flag comes up. It's not about the texting, it's about the intensity of the texting and about how that intensity could cause harm to her or put her in an unsafe situation. Girls may also have 2, 3 friends, 1, 2, 3 friends. So oftentimes people, when they think of autism, they say, oh, well, she has a friend, she has 2 friends, she can't be on the spectrum. That's not the case at all. They may have an extreme desire to have friendships, struggle how to make friendships, and therefore then they study other girls to really understand how to make friendships. They look at those social cues. They try to figure out those ways of interacting with other girls in order to look more, quote, neurotypical. For years, we've considered autism as a developmental disability in boys, and oftentimes we look at assessment tools, and assessment tools have been normed in boys and used on mainly boys because we've thought of autism as a developmental disability in boys. So when we're assessing girls and suspecting that they might have autism, we need to look outside some of those formal tools. We need to really hone in observation. We really need to look at interviews. We need to, if the young person, and she's open to it, provide with self-reflection checklists. There's fabulous self-reflection checklists. There's one out there called the UCC self-reflection for adolescent and adults, and give that to that person. They can really share how autism may be manifesting in them and give us more insight. So then we have masking, and masking is done by both females and males, but we often see this in females much more. Women and girls have reported that it takes so much out of them to be on all the time, to mimic what they are seeing, to mimic what they have studied and what others have demonstrated to them in certain situations so that they can hide their autistic behaviors. They become so exhausted. I had a colleague who shared with me not too long ago that she would mask so well at work. When she would go home, she was in bed for hours because her body was physically, emotionally, and psychologically exhausted. And it took so much out of her to stay on, if you will, during the day. So what do we mean by that? Having to concentrate on making eye contact, having to know when you make eye contact, How do you look at a person's face? When you're greeting somebody, what's that script in your mind that you need to go through when you're greeting? Look at the person, smile, shake the hand 3 times. When you're engaging in a social interaction, reading body language, reading the facial expressions of other people. Those are all things that girls really hone in on, and it is exhausting to them. Now, some boys, males do this as well, but we really know that girls tend to mask and camouflage more frequently. And it really mentally and physically overwhelms them, and sometimes can totally shut them down when they're not able to speak or to think clearly. And so that's one area that we really need to concentrate on when we're thinking about autism in girls, their ability to do so well of masking or camouflaging, if you will. Possible results of late diagnoses. Well, as you can see, this list shares quite a few issues that might arise or things that may happen if we have late diagnoses. We know that girls with ASD are three times more likely to attempt to commit suicide than girls without ASD. And we also know that research shows that anywhere between 20 to 35% of women with anorexia are on the autism spectrum. So those are things we need to really think about. We know that anxiety, depression, anorexia, suicide, bullying, all of these may be the result or contribute to what's happening with a person, a female, because of the late diagnoses. And so when we think about diagnosis for boys who have average to above average intelligence, who've been identified on the autism spectrum, sometimes they are not identified or diagnosed till end of elementary into middle school. Now, think about girls. They're 2+ years out from boys. So we're looking at girls who have average to above average intelligence, who are identified with autism, maybe late in middle school into upper high school and even beyond. They've missed all those years of early intervention, which are so important for individuals with ASD. So this is just a few things to keep in mind when you're thinking about autism and you're thinking about diagnosis in autism. I'd like to share with you, there's some resources that are really great resources on the OCALI website. There's a couple podcasts of panels of women and young girls on the autism spectrum that we did at a couple different OCALI conferences that we had, and we've taken those podcasts and put them onto our website so that you can hear from females on the autism spectrum. We also have an autism internet module on the OCALI Autism Internet Module site that talks a little bit more about autism as it manifests in girls, and that was written by Dr. Ruth Aspey. We have some webcasts, and then I encourage you to go to texasautism.com, that website, because there's also some information from Dr. Ruth Aspey and Dr. Barry Grossman on autism and how it manifests in girls. And I think I did it.